name's Lisa Abro. I think I've met all of you. Chair of Fair Vote Washington. And we are thrilled today to be hosting our two special guests, Clerk Casey Carl from Minneapolis and George Gilbert from the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center are here today from across the country.
Greensboro, North Carolina.
There you go.
Right.
Greensboro, North Carolina. So we'll let folks come on in and find us. Thanks. Come on in and find a seat. No problem. Is there anything else that I should be saying? Help me out, folks. I was not thinking to orient you. You all know why we're here. You're all welcome. We're glad to have you. Let's go ahead very, very quickly and let our two guests know who is at the table. So let me just start over with Jonesy, and we'll come around to David. You could be last. Can you just, excuse me, Ryan Jones. Sure. Just very briefly your name and what brings you here.
Yes. My name is Ryan Jones. I also go by Jonesy. I am the Chapter Development Coordinator of Fair Vote Washington. And I'm happy to be here to hear more about our local options bill that I'm very excited to be supporting.
My name is Brett Mullen. I am a volunteer with Fair Vote Washington as the Seattle chapter lead.
My name is Cassandra Allen. I am the newly hired field director for Fair Vote Washington, and I'm here to support the local options. We'll hear more about it.
Thank you. Lisa Abel, I've introduced myself.
I'm Walter Smith. I'm an intern with the Secretary of State. These two seats are probably going to be filled with Jay Jennings and Dave Elliott, who are the Legislative Director and Policy Director from Secretary of State, respectively. And I am doing a research paper this internship on ranked choice voting.
My name is Cindy Madigan, and I'm also a volunteer with Fair Vote. I am from Bellingham in Whatcom County.
I'm Diana Broderick, the Chief Deputy Auditor for Whatcom County. I'm also the co-chair of the Auditors Association Legislative Committee, and I'm very interested to hear real-life experiences.
My name is Andre Stackhouse. I'm from Seattle, and I'm recently volunteering with Fair Vote in the Speakers Bureau.
I'm here to support Fair Vote. Hear more.
George Gilbert.
Thank you.
Actually, I will give you a little background. I spent 25 years as the Director of Elections in Guilford County, North Carolina, which is the third largest county in the state. We had about 350,000 registered voters. Prior to that, I had 8 years in, I had 5 years in private business, but then before that I had 8 years in Washington, D.C. as a legislative assistant in the Senate, and a couple of years in the Congressional Research Service. Prior to that, I was just wandering around the country. And I'm doing that again now that I'm retired. So, thank you.
My name is Casey Carl. I am the Minneapolis State Clerk, and so I've had the experience of administering 2 of our 3 thus far RCV elections in 2013 and 2017. I actually became the clerk in 2010, the year after the first implementation in 2009. So I've overseen 2 of the 3 thus far. So excited to be here, and thank you to Fair Vote for hosting me.
My name is Jim Annist. I'm a volunteer with the First County chapter of Fair Vote, and I've been asked by Lisa to kind of focus on messaging. So I'd love to talk to any of you who are interested in how to articulate the arguments for ranked choice voting.
I'm Data Logan with Fair Vote, both in the state and national. And I also assist Sightline Institute. They have a ranked choice, an elections reform kind of project that they do.
I'm Steve Ladd, also from Bremerton, member of the Kitsap Fair Vote chapter, and I'm a retired city planner.
I'm Patty McGuire. I'm the Mason County Auditor.
I'm David Banks. I'm the treasurer of Fair Vote and of Fixed Democracy First, and I'm from Issaquah. I want to say, for point of order, that when we start presenting important material, I would like to reposition the camera so for better pickup.
Good. And
Yeah.
I'm going to actually do one point of order here for a moment too, which is I'm just noticing as we're gathering, this is great. Don't forget to speak up, everybody. But I do think I'm going to actually be annoying and ask if we could have the 2 of you switch with the 2 of you, so that I think it will be a little easier for most people to hear you if you're at this, at one end.
Apparently you two don't need to be
Thank
heard.
you.
And I'm sure I don't.
Thank you very kindly for humoring. Oh, I should have been, should I do anything more? I think you two can take it from here.
Yeah, okay.
What are you looking for? Let me crank up my machine here, because that will give me some structure. And I don't guess we don't need to introduce, how much introduction do you need in terms of, Lisa, what do you have in mind for the format of this meeting itself?
I would like this meeting to be especially responsive to our guests who have traveled here to be here, particularly auditors, Patty McGuire and Diana Bradrick.
Okay.
Excuse me. And I'm just looking around, we have a number of our supporters in the room, and I believe that we will have Secretary of State's office staff, potentially some other elected officials maybe arriving. So
Okay.
I'd love to have Diana and Patty say what would be helpful. Perhaps shall we start with some questions? Would that help?
Yeah, that'd be good.
That would probably help both of us figure out exactly what the lay of the land is. I don't know how much information about ranked choice voting some of them have. Were you involved in the presentation last summer with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center? They presented a seminar to the auditors.
Oh, yes.
Chris and Karen? Right. Yeah, you did.
Yes,
I figured
I did.
You probably were. So, I mean, you've gotten all that background.
Right.
You know, and if you want a refresher, I can do that too. But why don't we? Yeah, I like that idea of starting with questions.
And as so often happens, the people who show up for these events are the people who have diligently been trying to learn for a long time.
Right.
So my sense is there's not a lot of basic background that we need, that we should be able to get right to the questions that are, at the top of mind.
Yeah, I think if I could say anything to open, and I'm not sure, I think Casey would agree with me, but I'm not sure, but we had a lengthy discussion among us in the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center just last week about, what do we need to teach people about ranked choice voting and administering ranked choice voting elections, because we are really focused, the Resource Center is focused on administration. We're not an advocacy group. We obviously support ranked choice voting, but that's not our role to sell it to anybody. Our role is to support it and help people implement it effectively, efficiently, and accurately. Probably the most prevalent theme that we came up with in our entire discussion is that conducting a ranked choice voting election is really no different from conducting any other election. The biggest difference is in the content of the ballot looks different. The content of the instructions is a little different. It's not complicated. When we conducted a ranked choice voting statewide in the state of North Carolina with 89 days lead time, we had a one-paragraph set of instructions that we handed out to all voters when they arrived at the polls. I've always felt that if you couldn't explain your voting system to a voter in 24 seconds, that it was too complicated. And that was our goal, was to do that. And we conducted a statewide ranked choice voting election that had never been held before. Matter of fact, it had never been held before in anywhere, a statewide election, I don't believe, in the United States. And it turned, very successful. So second place winner on first choice votes ended up winning the election. There were no election contests. And the loser ultimately accepted the results. There was no litigation. If you run a good election, if you know how to run good elections, you can run good, efficient, ranked choice voting elections. Tabulation is different, but if you're doing, we're almost all doing automated tabulation systems anyway. And in that sense, you know, the tabulation system counts the votes by the rules that it's supposed to. People are less familiar with the tabulation process in ranked choice voting, and I would be happy to share a lot of the detail on that with you, because that's what I do really more than anything else, is the sort of the analytics and the system building these days. But in terms of election administration, it's really not much different. There's very few changes that have to be made to conduct the election. Would you agree with that?
I do. I think that's probably a fair assessment, having run it too. But as a starting, would it be fair to say, like, what's your burning question? And then maybe get the burning question from each person, and then that gives us a list and we can speak to that?
So, I mean, as background, I've been doing election work for almost 20 years. I was Deputy Secretary of State in Oregon and then worked for the Federal Voting Assistance Program in part of the Department of Defense. And I would call myself, philosophically, I think it's a great idea. I have big concerns about it from a practical standpoint. What I would like to see is the primary ballot for U.S. Senate in 2018 with 28 candidates. How on earth you give voters 28 by 28 choices on a piece of paper that's not this big? I mean,
you don't have to. The vast majority of voters, for instance, Cambridge is a good example. They have 9 seats they're filling. They'll have 18 to 28 candidates in any given election, and they in fact do put it all on one sheet, and they do, so theoretically it can be done. I would hate to do it as well. The proposed bill in Washington proposes 5 choices, 5 options, rankings. Our study, our research with the Center for Civic Design shows that somewhere between 4 and 7, say 4 and 6 rankings, 3 to 6 rankings is probably all the voters need in order to fully express their views. So limiting the number of rankings to less than the total number of candidates is a very, I mean, that's traditional. Minneapolis uses 3. San Francisco uses 3. But like I said, our usability research really suggests no more than about 6 or 7 at the most. 5's a great number, I think. So that makes it, you know, a lot more feasible to, you know, and more manageable for the voter. If you do have 28 candidates in a primary, how many did you all have for mayor?
35. We had 35 candidates, but our ballot design limited it to 3 choices plus a write-in. So in Minnesota, you have to allow for a write-in for any race in addition to those candidates, right? And so we had to structure the ballot in a way that it could read, with the technology we had at the time, the first choice column, which was the farthest column to the left, to produce immediate results. But you had 3 columns that repeated every candidate's name, and 3 columns plus the write-in option at the bottom. And then you could choose, right, across those, which were your top 3, or write in one if that was one of your 3. The way that helped us in Minnesota too, and every state has a little bit different rules, we can only produce one of 3 sides of ballots. There are regulations that say your ballot can be, you know, 14, 17, or 19, whatever the lengths of the ballot can be. So when we had 35 come up for mayor, and that's the top of the ticket for us in our municipal election, that created an issue for us. We actually produced our longest ballot that year that we've done in order to accommodate that. But one of the things that we've been looking with the vending community at is doing, you may have heard this Cambridge style ballot, which turns your ballot from this orientation to this orientation. The benefits of that are you list all the candidates once, and then multiple bubbles come across. So the ballot design becomes, in effect, a way of helping around the number of people. If we continue to use the portraiture style in 3 columns, the traditional way, there are limitations. We hit that. We were able to accommodate it, but for the future, if we want to move beyond 3 choices, which there is a move in Minneapolis to expand the number of options, then we would have to look into alternate ballot design in a Cambridge style, so that we could have multiple choices beyond the 3.
We also have the issue that, at least in part counties, they weren't able to get all the candidates in one column. So in a landscape mode, you'd have multiple pages for a single race. And
right.
But if you had that many candidates, it doesn't matter. It's not a matter of whether it's RCV or plurality election. If you have that many candidates, you've still got the same issue.
Well, except
there are a certain number of rows on a ballot.
The number of ovals to be filled in. I mean, 28 ovals versus 140 ovals.
But if you're only talking 5 ovals.
Well, but 5 ovals per 5 ovals times 28 candidates, 140 ovals.
No, 5 ovals, period. You're only making 5 choices. You're choosing 5 out of that 28.
But I could see his point. You'd have to have about 150 empty circles, and then the people would fill in 5 of them.
Yeah.
So that's his point.
So you've got the ovals.
It's still more ovals, more empty ovals.
Well, yeah, but that's empty
You can
ovals.
reach a limit in any.
And to George's point, I think what the piece there is, what's the level of options you give? How many choices or rankings do you give? There are different thoughts along that. We've stuck with 3 choices per race in Minneapolis. There's been pressure to expand that. The Minneapolis-St. Paul Twin Cities region, right across the river, the Mississippi from me, St. Paul offers 6 in each race. The difference between our ballots leads to the policy decision on how many rankings we offer. In St. Paul, they have 1 mayor, and they have, I believe it's a 7-member council. The mayor and council are staggered. In 1 year, the mayor runs alone. That's the only race on the ballot. It's literally one side of the paper, and so however many candidates they have, they're easy. The next time they run, it's the council, and the council doesn't run at large, they run from wards. So you only have, no matter what ward you're from, you have 1 question on the ballot. It's the council race. In Minneapolis, we have a very complex ballot. Our mayor, our council, our park board, and our board of estimate and taxation, of 22 races, all stand at the same time every 4 years. There is no staggering. And so we have to have a ballot that can accommodate as many candidates as are running in all 22 of those races. We also have a mix of single seat and multi-seat on our 1 ballot. And so our ballot's very complex in terms of layout and design. We've been able to make it work thus far with the 3 columns because we limit the number of choices. If we were to open that up in response to advocates in the community who want more choice in the ballot, then that would probably create an issue for us. And our only option would be go to a Cambridge-style ballot in order to accommodate that increase in growth. So ballot design is something we've been looking at both internally but also with our vendor partners to say, if we did this, could you accommodate it? Could you read the ballot? Could you reallocate those things? Is there a way of doing that?
So I was wondering, I guess 2 questions. One is, which races are multi-seat? That's kind of interesting. And the other one is, have you considered optical character recognition as an alternative to all those columns of rankings?
Yes to all those. So we in Minnesota are required to use an optical scan reader for our ballots for all races, for any election we run. And that's come in very handy working with our vendor in terms of the utility that they gave us to export the data from the ballot. So we actually export the data off of our ballot, and so for the write-ins, they actually take a picture. There's a picture taken of every ballot that's fed through, and we can get the image of the writing of the writing candidate, and we can work with that in our spreadsheets. So we do use optical scan. The other piece in terms of, I'm sorry, what was your first?
Oh, well, actually, the first question is what kind of races are multi-seat? And the second question is not just being able to see the writing, but could you just get them to write 1, 2, 3 in front of the candidates' names? Because
at this point, none of the vendors have that capability.
Okay.
Yeah, so, I mean, yes, that's another alternative that I was going to mention.
Right.
That would simplify the appearance of the ballot. is using optical character recognition. There are systems that are being designed. They are not currently in use in any public election that do use optical character recognition. The electronic, when you've got an electronic interface, it's very easy to use just number, my first choice, second choice, third choice, just assign them numbers, or you can arrange them in the order. But those voting systems are not currently available for public elections. You know, maybe one day they will be. They probably will be. So those are future options. The ballot has, every ballot, an optical scan ballot has a certain number of rows and a certain number of columns as its maximum capacity. If you exceed the number of rows that ballot has, you have to go to a second page of any kind of election, ranked choice voting or otherwise. Most of them, I think you can accommodate up to 35 or 45 on a 14 or 17 or 19 inch ballot. I think a 19 you may be able to go to 45 or something like that. So there are limits, physical limits on what is available. But this guy had the craziest one that I've seen, which the 35 candidates for mayor, which went to 33 rounds of tabulation.
Yeah.
And they displayed it on the wall. It covered the whole wall, but
it did. It was historic for us. We actually printed every round results to be fully transparent. And when we rolled out the, I think, 8-foot-long final tabulation, the mayor's race, and posted it in City Hall, it was quite an achievement. I literally walked out, it was midnight on the third day of tabulation, and I walked outside of City Hall and laid in Main Street, and it snowed outside. That's my memory of finishing the first one. But you asked about at-large seats. We have a 9-member park board that's elected, and 6 of them are by single-seat districts, and 3 are at-large. And then we have a unique body called our Board of Estimate and Taxation, and they have a very limited role. What the Board of Estimate and Taxation does is they set the maximum tax levy that can be assessed against your property, and they issue city debt bonds. They have, the mayor is a member, the chair or the president of the city council, the chair of the city council's Ways and Means Committee, member of our elected park board is also a member, and then there are 2 members who are elected at large from the city. And so those 2 at-large seats and the 3 on the park board are our 5 multi-seat races that we run. The mayor, 13 council members, and 6 park board members are all single seat. But again, that's 22 races. And to your point, ballot design, maybe we've hit it to death, but ballot design is of concern to me because currently Minneapolis runs its municipal election in an odd year. So we have a 4-year cycle. Of course, we have our federal years in every even-numbered year. What we call year 1 is the presidential election. Year 3 is what we call our gubernatorial. Our governor runs in the midterm congressional year, so we have presidential and we have gubernatorial. In between those 2 years, and the second year is the municipal year. And then my 4th year, I'm not supposed to have any elections, but we always have specials. So that's the special election year. The municipal year, therefore, is an odd number year, and it's the only thing we have as the city. But there's 22 races on that ballot. It's front and back, both sides of a large ballot. We now have our charter commission, which Minneapolis is a charter city, so the charter commission is sort of like our constitutional convention. They own the charter or keep it. They are proposing to move our municipal elections into an even-numbered year. The thought being that it will improve turnout, which right, wrong, or indifferent could be. The difficulty I have with that is, 1, we're achieving about 44% turnout in our municipal-only election. The national average is 15%, so we're way above on national average for municipal. The trouble with it is, Minnesota is one of the, our mayor calls it one of the votingest states. We're the votingest city. The problem is we came off of our presidential election with our city had almost 90% turnout, and then we do a municipal, and it goes down to 44. That feels like a big drop-off in turnout instead of just compare municipal to municipal and maybe other cities' municipal elections where it would be higher. So there's this challenge in perception, and is good enough? But if we move our municipal election into the even-numbered year, the challenge would be taking that normal, federal ballot, which is quite long, especially imagine if we did it in the presidential election, and then shoving these 22 city races into that. Our rules and regs in the state of Minnesota also lay out which races come first, and they have to be in the right order. So then you've got to work with your vending community to talk about ballot design that could accommodate the traditional plurality voting with a ranked choice voting and put it in line. And we also have a further complication that right now in Minnesota, the ballot must be the front and back of one piece of paper within one of these links. The only time you can go to a second piece of paper is for judicial races. So judicial races can be put on a second ballot page, but everything else is supposed to be on the front and back of one piece of paper. There is no physical way possible that we could do that. So there's obviously a legislative strategy to work with the legislature in terms of those rules that are heavily restrictive, but also with the vending community to explore what can technology do to mix these different ballot styles and accommodate different layouts in the middle of a ballot as well. They've been very open to discussing those things.
On that point, we have done that. We've had several states that have asked about that question. I know in Maine they made the decision to print a separate ballot for the ranked choice voting election, but that was purely an administrative decision, policy decision on their part. It was not required by any means. In 2010, we ran our ranked choice voting election as a part of the general election ballot with 13 candidates. And in that time, we used 3 columns, like you guys do. But we have also taken examples from other states. I know not too long ago, one of the folks, Karen Brinson Bell on the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, who does this sort of thing, she laid out a statewide ballot for one state in which there were non-ranked choice voting contests, then there was a ranked choice voting contest, then there were 2 more non-ranked choice voting, and then there were 2 more ranked. I mean, it was mixed all the way down, and she got it front and back on a 8.5 by 14 ballot. So, yeah, I mean, ballot layout is always a challenge. You know, but that's what we're supposed to do. I mean, that's what we do, and working with our vendors, figure out how to do it best. It's not always perfect, as we proved in 2000, but you know, it's generally doable. These are the kind of challenges that we face in elections, you know, every time around. You know, particularly when you have big ballots.
So this local option bill, my understanding is that it allows for 3 different implementations. And so from an administrative standpoint, are there concerns or considerations about having different systems? Could they end up, you know, on one ballot having a ranked choice and a non-ranked choice vote, and or be switching, you know, every year people feel like they're switching from one system to a different system? Are there concerns about that, or are there plans on how we'll make sure that voters are very clear on exactly how they're expected to vote?
You know, voters, you always have to give good instructions on a ballot. That's probably one of the bigger challenges that election administrators face, is being sure that they're clear on their instructions. And in ranked choice voting, we've done a lot of work. We worked with the Center for Civic Design on that as well, in terms of figuring out a combination of text and pictures usually works best. But ranked choice voting is not introducing a new phenomenon in terms of mixed ballot design. We've always had. I mean, when I first started as director of elections, I mean, it kind of went out of style, but we had single winner contests and we had multi-winner at-large contests on the same ballot. You were telling people vote for 1, vote for 3, vote for 4, whatever. So, I mean, that was, in some ways, I think that was, you have to modify the instructions so that people know. We conducted our ranked choice voting election as a part of a general election, so there were different kinds of contests on that ballot. Maine just did it last year. There were non-ranked choice voting and ranked choice voting elections. First time this on a statewide level in Maine. Things went smoothly. That's all I can say. All I know is that the experience that I have is that we didn't have the kinds of problems that have been speculated about in terms of voter education or voter confusion or administrative issues. We have not experienced, we did not experience that in North Carolina. They did not experience that in Maine. Election administrators they're fairly creative people, and they're very dedicated to making sure that the voters, know what they're voting on and understand the ballot and can follow it carefully. That's been my experience with this business of administering elections.
But I think to answer his question though, that with this local options bill, yes, you could have one ballot for one individual have 3 different methods in which they're voting for, right? So you could have Seattle City, how they elect their mayor and council members is different than how they could elect their school board members, that is different than how they could vote for their county council members or state elected offices. So you could be ideally looking at a ballot that has many different varieties, which would be unusual in Washington State. We don't typically vote for 2. We always vote for 1. So it would be. So I think to answer the question is that with this local option bill, how I read it is yes, you could potentially have a ballot on there that you're voting for in many different ways in many different races.
Well, you say many, you've listed 3.
That's many.
Yeah. Yeah. Y'all do 2.
Yeah.
Now.
Where maybe I misunderstood the question. And I come at it from less of a technical perspective, although I can appreciate that. My focus and when we run our elections and how I think about each election that we program is from the voter's perspective first. So I try and walk through it from the backwards perspective of what's the voter going to experience when they come in the polling place? How are they going to look at that ballot? What are they going to react to it? How are they going to heard the conversation about this method of voting before they walk into the polling place? What is that message and how am I going to control that message? Not that I'm going to be the one they listen to, but I want to be in their ear saying, nope, doesn't matter, here's how you fill it out. There's a lot of people who will say, vote this way and that'll make it stronger or better, and I want to make sure they know that's not true. So if there's different ways, one of the things we've done when Minneapolis launched first in 2009 and then in the next election cycle St. Paul launched, is we wanted to make sure that even though these things were being driven by the cities at the local level, that St. Paul didn't come up with counting policies and procedures that are wildly different than Minneapolis. And as they've looked at other cities, in the absence of statewide interest, this is where it could get off the wheels, that local election administrators would say, well, we're going to count it this way. And in the event of a tie, we're going to do it this way. And so those sort of rules and regs about the processing and tabulation of the ballot, irregardless of how many choices you might have, whether it's a multi-seat, a single seat, and how you tabulate, we wanted the policy processes to govern. And in Minnesota, there is in state statute for state elections and the elections that are administered in the traditional plurality method, a rule called voter intent. I don't know if you have this in statute here. We are required to give as much deference to the voter as possible. And for a traditional election, the Secretary of State has promulgated rules about implying and interpreting voter intent. That doesn't apply to ranked choice voting. So we found ourselves sort of unmoored from the state's guidelines. And what we did is we cleaved to those state lines as much as possible. Wherever it made clear sense, we followed the state's guideline, or we made a clear decision and we documented it. And we came up with our own voter intent guidelines. They've changed once. We ran the first election in 2009, right, our first time out of the chute, and it was pointed out to us that there was maybe some challenge to the voter if they voted a certain way, that their ballot was exhausted and couldn't be counted even though they marked someone further down the line. And so we went back, when I came in 2010, after that first election, one of the biggest things we focused on was voter intent guidelines. And again, consistent with state law to say, how do we make sure that our CV voter intent guidelines give the voter every opportunity? So even if they mismark it, how do we make sure we count that? If they skip their first choice but vote for the second and third because they've heard out there in the community that first choice is always eliminated, vote second and third, put your real preferred candidate third, right? You hear that. You're like, nope, that doesn't work. So, right, on one hand, you have a strong voter education. We do voter outreach and education really strong. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, George, the instructions on the ballot, right, that we take up that first talking about how to fill it out correctly, what to do. We also have little brochures that aren't part of the ballot that we are allowed to pass out in the polling place to talk about the voter guidelines on how to vote. We post placards, all over the place.
We're vote by mail, so signs in the polling place.
Right. Well, we actually
go in everybody's living room.
We actually have a very big vote by mail. We're not all vote by mail, but we have a big absentee balloting process and in-person balloting that is actually an in-person mirror of our mail ballot process in Minnesota. And so again, voter education has been really important for us in terms of doing it. So I started off by saying what I wouldn't want to have happen is allow the regulations to be determined on a municipal by municipal basis. And we've been very consistent in Minnesota to say, this is how we do it. If you want to opt in, here's the rules. And I think by having the two big cities consistent on that, as other cities are looking at this, because it's coming from the ground up and not the state down, and in the absence of that sort of consistency across the state, as cities are considering it, we just had another city, our neighbor to the west, St. Louis Park, has adopted ranked choice voting. There are other cities that are doing that right now. In fact, as I sit here, there's a hearing at our state legislature about a local options bill to allow statutory cities. Right now, if you're a charter city, you can do ranked choice voting, but if you're a statutory city, you cannot. And so there's a local options bill to say let the statutory cities choose that for themselves as well. But as we're going further into other cities, it's that consistency of the rules and regs and what the messages are in how voter intent is applied, how it's determined. And we have a chart that, so we pass out to our counters. This is, if it looks like this is what you do.
So I have a question about voter intent. There's one mark on the ballot which is in the far right column. Does that mean I love that candidate or I hate him?
I don't interpret if you love or hate them. What I do, and I have three choices. If you've skipped option 1 and 2 and you put a mark in option 3, that's your number 1. So that your ballot is counting right from the beginning. That's option 1 for you. You forego marking 2 and 3.
There are a variety of rules that are used across the country to handle, let's say, skip rankings. Some states, some jurisdictions immediately exhaust the ballot. Maine, I think, used what I consider a reasonable rule. If you have 2 consecutive skips, it exhausts the ballot. They'll allow you to skip 1, but not 2. Minneapolis, you can skip, they just ignore skipped rankings. And those are the 3 primary ways. But the bill also gives the Secretary of State's office the responsibility to promulgate a lot of these rules, which I think, speaks to the point that Casey is bringing up. Is, yeah, you need to have uniformity in some degree. You need to have some consistency within a state, whether, and I don't know what the relationship between the Secretary of State and the cities and the auditors is in Washington precisely, but hopefully they try to work together to produce a positive result. I know in North Carolina, usually we did, but not always. But yeah, if they can, if they've got some guidelines that give them a consistent way to manage those issues, it's manageable. I guess I'm trying to figure out what.
Did you see unintended consequences? I mean, one of the things that happens, I think going back to something Julie said, it's really rare in Washington for it not to be vote for one. And in Whatcom County, because I'm a charter county, once every 10 years, we vote on the Charter Review Commission. So now you've got 3 positions that have 16, 17, 18 candidates. And all of a sudden, you can put in, the instructions are on the ballot. We think they're clear. It's in the insert. you know, it should be clear what they're supposed to do. All of a sudden, your overvotes go through the roof because they can't figure out, and they're looking at this one race where they can vote for 16 people, and what they're supposed to do with these other ones. And you'd think that that wouldn't happen because every other race says vote for one, but it does. So my question with ranked choice voting when you've got a mixed mode ballot is, do you see more overvoting or not? No.
Actually, the studies that we've seen most recently show less overvoting.
Interesting.
Yeah, and we do, and this is one thing that I think that, you know, very pertinent question for any of us really is, you know, what impact does it have on the voters, as Casey said? That's really our focus, you know. But the studies that I have seen where they have done surveys and where they have studied the, you know, things like, you know, how many overvotes do you have, are showing a very either comparable or better performance. You know, they're not showing that the voters are getting more confused. Like I said, in 2010, we had that exact scenario where, and yeah, everything's vote for one now. We used to have at large, but we don't anymore. Going to single transferable vote, like they do with their park board in Minneapolis, would reintroduce that. We did, you know, judicial races normally in North Carolina have 2 candidates running in November, and you pick one. This was a 13-candidate special election with 3 choices. Boom. If you give the voters good instructions at the point of voting, and that to me is the most important thing, at the point of voting, because that's when they're paying attention. They're not paying attention always, you know, 3 weeks before the election and stuff like that. But at the point of voting, they can handle most of this stuff. And they seem to.
What election count system are you using, Kate?
So in Minneapolis, our vendor is ES&S.
Okay.
We have ES&S, and we bought a brand new system in 2013, the first year I ran an election using ranked choice voting. We've been working with them since 09, so 09 was our first, 13 and 17. In 09, we did a complete hand count because there was no equipment on the marketplace that would automatically tabulate a ranked choice voting ballot. So I wasn't there, it was the year before I came. The process they committed to as a city was that they would be fully transparent to all the voters, the candidates, the media, the stakeholders, since it was the first time and the first in the state, that they would do this publicly. And so they had a big warehouse, our elections warehouse. We cleared it out. We set up counting pod tables, and everyone was allowed to stand around the perimeter of the room and watch the tabulation, and they committed to full tabulation in every race. So even when it was clear, like on the first round of counting, that this is the winner, they said, nope, count out every ballot. And so because of that commitment to be fully transparent and counting out all options through every ballot in every race, it took 15 days to complete the election. So you can imagine that the advocates, the candidates, the media, the public were not happy. And that's when I came in, right after that. And it was like, you will not repeat, right? You will not repeat 15 days, right? You will not be doing 15 days. So we worked with our vendors, and they came up with a system. Although it still doesn't automatically tabulate ranked choice ballots, it produces what I mentioned, that exportable data file. So it gives us in Excel, in Microsoft Excel, the outcomes for every race in every column. So here are all the people who voted for this candidate in this race in column 1, meaning choice 1. Here's every column they got 2, 3. It also takes a picture for the write-ins. So the first thing we have to do is we call it scrubbing the data, which that's not a good term, I self-admit, because people go, what are you doing to the data? Well, the biggest thing we're doing is we're typing in the names, which are a photo image. You can't work with that. So we have to take out the image and type in the name, so we have digital data to work with. And once we get all that done, we start the tabulation process following the rules exactly as our ordinance lays it out. It's time-consuming to do it. It's not near like a hand count. We went from 15 days in 09 to 3 days in 2013. And 2 of those days, 2 full days, were for the mayor, where we had 35 candidates, where we mentioned at the end we had that 8-foot-long spreadsheet printout. So 2 full days just to do the mayor's race, we had 35 candidates. we were able to produce election night results because of some policy changes we made. For example, where it's clear you don't need to keep tabulating and transferring ballots because somebody has cleared the threshold, stop. Stop the counting. They've won. You've got a winner. All you're going to do is either keep increasing their number or bring up the losers a little bit, and we don't care. If we were taken to court, we would then process that all out. But what we did was we came up with what we call the maximum possible threshold, right? This is an inflated number on election night. It's not the true threshold to win. It's a higher threshold. So if you pass like the 2/3 threshold required to win, we know you're going to win. There's no amount of retabulation where you could get enough votes to win. It's mathematically impossible. So if you can clear that 2/3 maximum possible threshold, you're declared an unofficial winner until the canvassing board certifies on election night. We were able to do that in almost 2/3 of our ballot in 2013. But it's that policy change of the maximum policy threshold that we weren't going to count write-ins. I don't know if you're required to count write-ins here. We were at that time required to count all write-ins and tabulate for them. So I can't tell you how many lizard men counted ballots, Spider-Man, Batman, Mickey Mouse, right. So we were required to count all of those in 2009 in addition to the full hand count. That took a lot of time. And we said we don't do that for federal races, we don't do that for state races, we don't do that for county races. Why are we required to do that for city races? So we had to go get legislative change to say, why do you require us to count all the write-ins for city, but you don't for higher levels of government? So that provided actually some consistency in terms of election administration. We don't count the write-in unless you declare 7 days before the election that you're a write-in candidate.
That's the way Washington is now.
We weren't that way before, imagine. So we got that changed. We have the maximum possible threshold, changed our policy. We had new voter intent guidelines that consistently provided the maximum opportunity for every voter. If you put a mark on that ballot, we were counting it in some way, shape, or form, but we were doing it consistently. Whether you skipped the first, or you marked the first, skipped the second, marked the third, we had consistent voter intent guidelines, and then we had this exportable data file that allowed us to move data much faster. So that moved us from 15 days to 3 days, and in 2017 it was 1. And not even a whole day. It was less than 24 hours, and we were able to declare about 1/3 of the ballot on election night, and the 2/3 that we couldn't declare, we declared in less than 24 hours.
So what do you do if somebody votes? What if they overvote? So you've got 35 candidates and they mark 1, 2, and 2 number 3s.
So if there's an overvote in our column, we don't count that column. We
At
can't
all.
reconcile. That column gets eliminated and we move, right?
So if they
And
overvote.
some jurisdictions exhaust the ballot over and over, but
Okay, so that's just
there are
one of
different sets of rules there
Yeah,
too.
okay.
See, the different sets of rules are if you exhaust my ballot because I had that error, my whole ballot's out of play in that
Right.
race.
I agree.
And so we have said, nope, if we can reconcile that ballot by saying, okay, let's say you marked 1 person in your first choice, you accidentally put 2 in your second column and 1 in your third, we're gonna eliminate the second column. We can't distinguish who you meant to choose,
Right.
and your third becomes your second. So your ballot stays in play as long as possible for a candidate of your choice. The other thing I would say that we've done in terms of the voter education is we've worked with the schools. You talk about all mail and stuff like that. Working with the schools gets to parents and gets to the voters. We find we've done videos that show the process, and we work with candidates because if anybody's going to carry the message to a voter, it's the candidate going to the door. And so by helping to equip candidates with what ranked choice voting is and simple ways of describing it, simple ways of describing the process, we've not only, I think, sort of enlisted or enrolled the candidates to our side of making sure that voters are informed, but they become sort of ambassadors and educators at the time that they're knocking on doors or calling people or at events. And so those have been other tools and tactics we've used.
And I think Minneapolis has a very good one-page, one-side instruction flyer that they send out with their by-mail ballots. That gives you the advantage here. You're all mail. Boom. You're already sending voting instructions to every voter along with the ballot. So you're just changing the content. And there's some very good examples, but we have at the Resource Center online and in Minneapolis and others, and you might want to modify those, but you don't have to reinvent the wheel on this stuff. It's been done, somewhere probably already, most of it. And so that's, if you look at the one page, how to vote, it shows how to vote and how it's counted. So it gives the voter some idea of how these things, what are your rules regarding overvotes? What are your rules regarding skipped votes? They can be graphically and textually presented in a very simple format. And if you send that out with every ballot, the voters got a pretty clear picture if they read the instructions. My experience with voters, and it's a kind of a humorous tale, that every election somebody calls up. We had direct electronic voting equipment when I was super director of elections. And particularly in the early years of DRE equipment, I'd always get calls on election day from somebody that complained about the fact that, people, the elderly and people with low education are going to have a problem with this and blah, 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 blah. I have a master's degree, and almost every single one of those people that called me had a master's degree. But I didn't get calls from the elderly and the low income and the less educated people because they read and listened to the instructions. And that's kind of anecdotal, I realize, but nevertheless, I think we've all sort of seen that in our lives, and if people don't read instructions, you can't really help them.
To your point about ballot errors, we've been lucky to do a survey after each one of our elections. So we actually do a statistically valid survey that we outsource after every ranked choice voting election, and we survey voters, non-voters, according to how they self-disclose. Yes, I voted. Here's my experience. No, I didn't vote, and here's why. We also include candidates, and we include poll workers. And so that survey data has been helpful in establishing a baseline in Minneapolis about how people feel about ranked choice voting. And we've also then analyzed our own ballot data, which we put on our website. So our website, we put all the ballots out for all the elections, we put all the data, we put all our reports, we put all the surveys. You can go look at it yourself, draw your own conclusions. We've tried to be transparent without drawing conclusions. I also do a report after every election, RCV or not, to our elections committee on the council, which identifies what worked, what didn't, lessons learned, where we missed, what we're going to do in the future, and policy recommendations. I gave a copy of some of these resources to Michael, both in print form and digital form, so you all have them. It includes an example of our last ballot, our elections committee report, survey, voter intent guidelines that I mentioned in print form. So those resources are out there. We do the survey, and to the point about ballot errors, one of them that we see the most is not really an error. It's a misuse of an RCV, but it's permissible, and the other one is an error that we see a lot. And those two that we've seen the most of are not overvotes or undervotes, ironically, which we worry about. They undervoted, they overvoted. Where we see a true error the most is what I call bullet voting or repeat ranking. I like my candidates so much, I'm going to list them 1, 2, and 3. And we go, great, we're going to count them one time.
Yeah.
And if they're eliminated, they're out. You don't get, well, my second vote. No, because it's one vote, not multiple votes. It's a ranking that ultimately equals a vote. And getting that message across to people, that bullet voting does not help your candidate. It doesn't. So that's the one we see the most. And then the other one, which is permissible, it's not an error. It's just not using a ranked choice ballot. They rank their candidate number 1 and they're done. They don't rank anybody else. We've seen a lot of that, and especially from certain communities who come in droves to vote for their candidate. Minneapolis has the largest Somali population in the United States, the largest Somali population outside of Somalia, and we have seen in that community in particular, they don't rank beyond 1. They'll come in and rank their candidate, and they're not interested in doing more than one candidate. So that's been a phenomenon unique to that community. We've actually worked directly with community elders and leaders in the Somali community to explain that they have more choice, but that really comes down to their preference, and in the end, they're voting for their candidate, and they're allowed to do that. And so those are the two outliers. We've seen actually over the 3 elections we've conducted, more people are choosing to vote or rank more people in more races. So the more comfort they have with, oh, I can choose 1, and I can also choose 2 and 3 if I choose. So in the first year, in in '09, I called it the year of incumbents. It took 15 days for us to basically re-elect everybody who was already on the ballot. Because there was no competition. And those of you who are in this business know the thing that drives turnout more than anything else, study after study, research consistently shows, are competitive races and competitive or controversial ballot questions. That's going to get people to the ballot. That first year in '09, it was all incumbents. There were only 3 out of 14, I'm not even including park board, out of the mayor and council, 14 seats, 3 people changed. It wasn't a big race. It was actually our lowest turnout, in fact, in a 24-year period. But in 2013, when we had 35 candidates for mayor, and we started having real candidates, real competition amongst the 13 wards and the park board, all of a sudden you had bigger turnout, you had more rankings, and then in 2017 we had a lot of competition. We didn't have as many candidates for mayor, but the candidates we did, it was highly competitive. And we had competition in all but I think 1 seat out of 22. And by competition I mean more than 2, 3, sometimes 5 or 6 in every race. And we saw more rankings and more options used. So I think it's familiarity, using it consistently, having that and becoming comfortable with those rules, and hearing that repeated message about knowing it's coming and how do you mark your RCV ballot.
Do you have any experience, or do you know of any place that has experience where you've got a local option to do RCV and the jurisdiction is straddling county lines?
No, but I know your bill addresses that. I had one of our cities in North Carolina that straddled county lines with us and the neighboring county. If there was a statewide election, Guilford County voters voted in Guilford County, and Alamance County voters voted in Alamance County, and we both put it on the ballot. If there was not a statewide election, and Alamance County wasn't having, we had a contract that basically said Guilford County will conduct the election and everybody will vote in Guilford, you know. So, I mean, that was how we worked it out there. I think those same kinds of issues would have to be worked out, you know. And it would be particularly troublesome if the 2 counties had 2 different kinds of voting systems.
That's
you know,
the question.
But nevertheless, one voter is looking at one ballot. They're not looking at both ballots and trying to and getting confused between the 2. So one voter is looking at one ballot, and obviously that's a case where, you know, the 2 county auditors would need to coordinate and say, hey, we're going to lay the ballot out the same way or as closely as possible. You know, so those are the kind of local, you know, difficulties that you have to kind of negotiate. But like I said, that's the way we did it in North Carolina when we had that kind of split city situation. And the voters would go to different polling places, and we'd notify them all. We'd send them all a letter saying, for this election, this is where you go vote. By the way, one thing that Minneapolis I wanted to mention with regard to, and I think that makes it a very positive thing in Washington, is the most effective voter education tool, according to their studies, was their mailing of a voter guide to all voters. Well, y'all do that anyway because you're mailing them the ballot and the voter guide with it. And that was rated in their post-election studies as the most effective educational tool.
Not only that, but a lot of people said it was their reminder that, oh yeah, there's an election.
Yeah, it's a great reminder.
We chose to send to every household. So the county where I'm at, Hennepin County is required under state law to do the postal verification mailing. If you have something similar, where before the election they mail to the registered voter's household, and if it comes back, then that voter has moved. It's sort of a verification of you're at your address. But that's all they do. So it's to registered voters. What we made the decision of doing was we got every household in Minneapolis, and we sent this voter guide out, a multi-page voter guide that included a sample ballot, instructions on how to mark RCV, where to find more information on the web, what races were on the ballot, and even some pictorial examples. And I included an example of that in the resources that I left. But that voter guide in our post-election surveys was identified as the best way of knowing about RCV, marking RCV, reminder that I have to go vote. Oh, here's my sample ballot, and that's what it's going to look like. So, I mean, we, again, looking at it from the voter's perspective as my starting point, we said, what could we do to really empower every voter to participate and feel like they know how to do it? So this voter guide was really important to us. What was more important from my perspective is when I joined the city in 2010, my position, I went to the chair of our elections committee on the council and said, hey, I have all these great ideas for voter education and engagement and civic engagement, things like that. And I was told, whoa, it's not your job. Candidates do that. You just open up the polling place and give access to the ballot.
I had that same experience early on.
And I had other election administrators around the state who said to me, whoa, what are you doing? We'll be expected to do this stuff too. Stop. And I was really disheartened by that because I really felt like, for me, what drove my career in my public service was in civic literacy and in empowering people to really engage and grab those levers of power. And so I felt sort of like, well, really, that doesn't make sense. So I came up with this argument that went something like this. Target, as you may know, is headquartered in Minneapolis. So I said, well, I feel like I'm Target. I have stores where you can buy goods, including cake mixes, for example. But I'm not Duncan Hines or Betty Crocker or name your favorite cake mix. Those are the candidates. And yes, they're going to tell you to go to that store to buy theirs, but I have well-located stores with convenient parking and access, knowledgeable clerks, it's well lit, and I started using this sort of corporate analogy. And then ironically, by the time 2013 came around and it was time for my council to stand for election, in a public meeting, one of the council members at the time sort of threw out there this question to me that said, well, you know, it would be helpful for us as candidates if we could have access to some of your literature and the educational materials that you're doing. Well, we hadn't done anything. Nothing, because we've been told no. And I took that as a yes, of course, and so we went full bloom into voter education. And I took that as permission on the dais that I am now expected to do voter education and outreach. And it started in 2013, where this voter guide became important was so many people liked it in the post-election data that we could provide to our policymakers, that now we do this not just for RCV elections, we do it for federal elections, we do it for state elections. It's now expected that we're going to produce a voter guide. It's going to be mailed to every household. It sort of has become a standard for us in terms of how we connect with voters, that we're going to have an early voting center. Under state law, the clerk is supposed to open up their own office for people who want to vote in person early. But we had so many lines showing up because of our ethnic communities where English is not a first language. They really rely on that in-person early voting, a 46-day period before election for us, where we have to serve them. They had lines from my window, my countertop, out into the City Hall rotunda and out the door. We couldn't serve that many people. So I got the City Council to agree to give us a new facility. And we open it up, and it's our early vote center. And the only thing we do there is in-person early voting. But all of those things took really connecting and thinking about it from the voters' perspective to start with, and selling the policymakers on why that was important. And we've been able to then turn the dial each time. But where I'm most proud is that these surveys and the data that we're able to provide have allowed us to expand that beyond RCV. So when we talk about voter engagement, we do that every year. And it's now considered a core function of my elections program is voter outreach and engagement. So RCV opened the door to that. That was a very positive win for my office. We weren't doing any of that beforehand.
How were your elections or your job funded?
My job?
Yeah.
So my position is funded through the city's general fund. The city clerk, I wear 4 major hats, if you will, in Minneapolis. So if you're voting in Minneapolis, I consider my most important job providing access to the ballot, right? So I'm the elections administrator for the city. I run federal, state, city, school, any election. If you're in Minneapolis and you're voting at my polling place with my election judges, with my ballots. So elections is one of my big hats. The other hat I wear from a corporate perspective on behalf of the city enterprise is I am the custodian of all city data and information assets. And so in Minnesota, we call it the Data Practices Act. We're the only state that calls it that because we're special. Everybody else calls it freedom of information or open records. So I'm the custodian of all the records, and my job is to make sure that public data is public and private data is not released. And so I have that responsibility, and as part of that hat, I keep the city archives, records management duties, retention scheduling. My day-to-day hat is I am the clerk and parliamentarian of the city council. We have a full-time council of 13 members. They have a strong standing committee system that meets on a 2-week cycle. So I am the legislative facilitator of the council and prepare their agendas, their records, publish the charter and code and the ordinances and maintain those records. And then the fourth hat I wear is I am the only department head in the city structure that works exclusively for the council. We have a mayor-council structure, and the council, under our charter, it says they elect me to a 2-year term, and I serve at their pleasure, and I can be reelected. And then I am, in that capacity, the department head of our legislative department, which includes the council and their offices, and then the office of city clerk and its 3 major divisions. And so that's responsibility for budget, payroll, personnel, operations. And so those are the 4 hats that I wear as the city clerk.
Do you get state and county funding too to support the elections?
No.
It's all city.
Right. The only state pass-throughs we got were when HAVA money was being dispersed by the states to the counties and from the counties to us. And that went mostly for equipment purchase. In 2002, the HAVA funds primarily went to buy the mandated automark machines. I don't know what you call them here in Washington, but the automatic ballot marker machines, which have not been replaced since they were first purchased in 2003 and need to be. And so that's a whole other side conversation about technology and elections. But that's the only real pass-through we've gotten was for those purchases under the Help America Vote Act of 2002.
What's the maximum number of elections you would hold in a year?
It depends on the specials, right? So in our normal 4-year process, year 1 is the presidential, and we would have the primary in August and the general in November. The next year is the municipal. We'd only have the RCB, so we don't have a primary anymore. We'd have our general in November. The next year is the state election, gubernatorial, and we'd have a primary in August and a general in November. And in the 4th year, we wouldn't have any regularly scheduled programs. We have specials usually. The state legislature recently passed a law that said any special elections have to be held on certain dates. In the past, it was called at the proclamation issued by the governor, so it could be any time. Now there are certain dates when special elections can be called, which helps us to kind of plan our calendar ahead. Next year's presidential is going to be interesting for us because Minnesota has a strong tradition of political caucusing before a primary, so the political parties get together and caucus for candidates, and because of the experience in the last presidential election, the state legislature said we're not going to do that anymore in presidential elections. We can't leave that to the parties, and so next year in March, there will be a presidential preference poll, they call it, that I have to administer. So basically the caucus process. That will be the first time we've done that. So we'll be doing a presidential preference caucus in March, a presidential preference poll, they call it, in March. And then, of course, everybody knows Census Day is April 1st, and I'm involved in that. And then we'll have the the primary, the regular primary in August, and the general in November.
So your special elections only happen?
So the legislature passed a bill that said if you're having a special election, they should be called, I think it's like April, there's a month in each quarter.
But in any year, or only in? Only in
Not
year
federal
4?
years, but like for state and local elections, if you're calling an election to fill a vacancy, for example, then you would call it in those timelines. And so they've been set out in state law. In the past, it was just sort of whenever there's a vacancy, there was this call. And we experienced in 2011, we had 3 special elections that were all called. And because the governor had called them and called them and called them, we literally were doing special elections within 2 weeks, 3 different within 2 weeks.
Yeah.
That didn't make sense. It's just that the governor had called the proclamation, then, oh, here's another vacancy. Well, here's a proclamation. And then another vacancy. Well, here's a proclamation. Instead of saying, okay, we're going to put those all on this date. So it gave a little bit more uniformity and consistency to the calling and scheduling of special elections, which we haven't had one called since that law passed, but we're grateful that it passed.
We have specials in February and April, potentially, but every year. So a lot of us are running for elections
Right.
here. So this year, for example, I've only got 3 because nobody's going in April, but in a presidential year with the preference primary.
So you already have
Last time we had 5.
Yeah.
Because we had a February and an April and a preference and then the primary and general. All right, we're taking a look at legislatively, we may be changing some of those dates, but right now, that's kind of how it works. So I was just curious if you were running 4 elections a year, usually, or 2 elections a year.
2 usually. Yeah.
We had an average of about 2.5 a year during my tenure. My first year, when I had no experience and didn't know what I was doing, we had 5. So I was,
Yeah.
including the presidential. So,
Yeah.
But yeah.
So, Casey, having done this, I'm Julie Wise, I'm the King County Director of Elections here
Hi,
in
nice
the
to meet
Seattle
you.
area, the
Yeah.
1.3 million registered voters. It's Lovely to talk to you both. Thank you for
You
coming
have
out. and-
amazing resources on your website, by the
Oh,
way.
thank you.
Stealing ideas all the time.
Okay,
Borrow.
it's
Borrow.
mutual. It's
Yes.
mutual, right? We just took them from Oregon, so we're just passing it along, right? Fantastic to have you all here. I'm sorry, I feel like the election administrators, very typically of us, are trying to rule the conversation. So I apologize. I know there's only 15 more minutes or so, but if you were to build this, sort of Washington has had just kind of a little foray into ranked choice voting there. If you were to build ranked choice voting with your experience, and you've seen the legislation that's going forward today in our House, how would you go about it? I know as an election administrator, one of the things that I really struggle with is I really feel like voters should decide how voters want to vote. That's something that I think is really important. Of course, we elect officials to make a lot of decisions, but as an election administrator for 18 years, it's really hard for me to not think that voters should make that determination of how they vote, and to see something where we can provide consistency kind of across the state. As we discussed, there's lots of options. A jurisdiction could have a primary or not have a primary, and that could be for county, city, school, fire districts. In King County, I have 192 jurisdictions that I run all of those elections. And just this year alone, in our odd years, are big local elections. So we have over 360 offices that are up for election. So I'm just kind of interested, like if you were to build ranked choice voting in a new state, how do you think that with the lessons learned that you both experienced, how you would go about it?
Big question. And
well, that's why I took 5 minutes to
And I'll
frame it.
start with this presumption. I agree with you that, in my opinion, voters should choose. My story follows exactly that. I wasn't even in Minnesota, let alone Minneapolis, when the vote passed to put ranked choice in place. So that was a community-led effort. It was really grassroots. Even though some of our policymakers had championed the reform, it was driven by the community. It passed 2-1 at the ballot in 2006 to be used in 2009. I came in 10, right? So it was in place, and it had worked in 2009. There were some hiccups, some challenges, of course. It was a change, and that's when I was told quite clearly, you need to, make this better. And I said, well, I didn't choose this, but if this is my role as an election administrator, I'm going to be the best at it, by gosh, right? As probably all of us would do. So I think that if you had a chance to start from scratch, my tendency, I've said it a couple times now, I hope that plays out, I'd start with the voter in mind. So if I'm starting with the voter in mind, and especially given this idea that maybe there's a city that's split between two counties, and how does this affect, with the voter in mind, I think the most important things would be you have uniformity and consistency in the rules and regulations in terms of how that's applied, that there are clear and consistent guidelines and standards, for example, along voter intent, ballot design and layout, how counting will be done and when, and if there's ties, how do you resolve them, and at what point in the process. So those sort of high-level governing things, I would feel it's very important for those to be consistent, regardless of where I'm at, because as a voter of the state, and the only place we can really point to now is Maine, right? A whole state's tried it. I'm pretty sure that the election administrators in Maine would say the same thing, that it's really important, no matter where you're at in Maine, no matter where you're at in Washington, our experience as voters would be the same, that you don't have some perceived advantage or disadvantage because of the way an election administrator or a group of policymakers chose to have you experience ranked choice, or just voting. Let's forget ranked choice voting, versus what I got. So I mean, I would start at that high level, and that would cascade a series of questions and decisions down from there. But in a simple answer to your response, I'd start with the voter. I'd start with the outcomes that I want all voters to be equal treatment, equal access to the ballot, that the ballots are treated equally the same. So that would get into all kinds of rules and regs and processes that we could spend the next days talking about.
We had that challenge in North Carolina. It didn't relate to ranked choice voting, but it's relevant to all elections, because when I began in 1988, elections in North Carolina had largely been run at the local level. The state office of elections had a director, one person who handled campaign finance, and one assistant director. They had a staff of 3 people. The State Board of Elections. So there was no uniformity enforced across the state. When Gary Bartlett became state director a few years later, one of the early things he did, he learned that we needed that kind of uniformity. We needed to pull this together, and so he brought a group of us together. I'd say probably maybe 8 or 10 of the directors from around the state, and we started working on a uniformity project, you know, which ultimately, you know, pulled that kind of thing together for us, and we started creating that. You have the opportunity with ranked choice voting to do exactly what Casey's talking about. Is you can start out that way. If you start out with consistent and uniform rules and regulations, then it's much easier for the people at the local level to implement, you know, whatever it is, and you don't run into the conflicts between cities or jurisdictions and that sort of thing. And we did have the advantage in North Carolina, we had one vendor, you know, but we had both DRE and optical scan, so we actually had two different types of voting systems. So it wasn't, you know, completely uniform. So we had 89 days to run a ranked choice voting election. It was a special election due to a vacancy that occurred less than 90 days prior to the election. And the law that they had passed several years before, which had never been used, called for this to be done by ranked choice voting. Well, you know, we didn't know what to do. My quote in the Raleigh News and Observer on about the 80th day prior to the election is that we're looking at a train wreck. You know, Gary still reminds me to this day of my quote. We had no way to tabulate we had direct electronic voting equipment with voter verifiable paper trail. We had these reels of paper. We didn't have ballots that you could sort. You know, I said, there's no way in hell we're going to be able to count these ballots accurate. Well, make a long story short, we came up with a way to do it electronically. The state and us working together came up with a way to export the cast vote record, import it into Excel, and tabulate it in Excel. So it wasn't a train wreck. And I learned a valuable lesson in that. And that valuable lesson was that it makes a huge difference whether or not you say, we can do this, or we can't do this. The state said, we can do this, we have to do this, it's the law. You know, and I was opposed to the law, but that doesn't matter. I still had to do it. And until I turned my head in that direction and said, okay, let's work together to make this happen, you know, it would have been a train wreck had I not adopted a different attitude. And ultimately, that sort of change of perspective led me to the motto that as election officials, we can do any damn fool thing the legislature tells us to. You know, it may not be pretty, but we can do it. So that's been my experience with, you know, both the uniformity issue, you know, and how do you approach it? You know, what's the way to approach any kind of change that, if the General Assembly represents the people, we're in a republic, remember? You know, the General Assembly is supposed to reflect the will of the people, and ultimately they have to answer to the people. The City Council has to reflect the will of the people, or they get replaced by somebody else.
Well, county auditors do.
You know,
we're elected.
You're elected. You have to be responsive to the will of the people. I wasn't. I was appointed, so that's, you know, but, you know, it differs from state to state. But, you know, the experience in most jurisdictions, for instance, Maine just was given the opportunity to repeal ranked choice voting, and they passed it they rejected that repeal by a larger margin than they passed it the first time. The same thing happened in Memphis. The city council in Memphis, which had had ranked choice voting on the books now for over 10 years and hadn't implemented it yet, and they still haven't implemented it, but they put a repeal provision on the ballot last year in Memphis, and even though the people in Memphis have not yet experienced ranked choice voting, they rejected the repeal. So these, we have examples of around the country of elected officials and the people differing. But, I don't think it matters which one initiates it. It doesn't have to be a citizen initiative. If it is initiated by the General Assembly or the City Council, they represent the people too. And those of us who are responsible for administering the law, that's our responsibility.
In Minneapolis, what can you say about how RCV has positively or negatively affected the political process in the ways that are generally attributed, the positive things that are attributed to RCV, such as more positive campaigning and better proportional representation and higher voter turnout? Are you allowed to speak to something like that?
Sure, you're taking all my speaking points from the legislature this afternoon, but I'll give you a preview. Ranked choice voting has definitely changed how our candidates run for office. So in the traditional sort of find out who your opponents are and do oppo research and attack and do TV ads, radio buys, get high level or well-known endorsements in the paper, that's what we used to have. I would say that's standard fair politics 101, campaigning politics 101. That didn't really happen in 2009. Remember I said 2009 was the year of incumbency. I was just put them back in office for 4 more years. In 2013, when we had 35 candidates for mayor, we really saw that in the mayoral race, which got spotlighted a lot by the media. You had 35 candidates, and how do you tell these people apart? And a few of the candidates tried that traditional tactic. They took out TV ads, they tried some attack ads, they did the traditional form of campaigning. What they found is the backlash hit them so hard, the media stopped inviting them to things. And as a result of this, because you needed to get the second and third choices of your competitors, you needed to eat away at their base to secure your base, the focus switched from what my opponent won't do, or what my opponent is saying, or what my opponent's lying about, to here's what I stand for. Here's where I would be on this policy. Here's what I want to do if given the chance to be elected. And can I have your first vote? And if not, can I have your second? Like, that became a thing. If I can't be your first choice, can I be your second? It culminated, and I will share with this group more than I had planned. The Star Tribune is our major paper in the metro area, in the state of Minnesota, and it's headquartered in Minneapolis. And they had taken a position in favor of ranked choice voting in 2004 through 2006, the campaign that led to its ballot question, where it passed 2-1. They wanted RCV, thought it was a great idea. Towards the end of the 2013 mayoral campaign, there were editorialists in the Star Tribune who were saying, come on people, you have to differentiate yourself, right? You have to distinguish yourself. People were afraid to go too far away. And at one campaign stop at our University of Minnesota, the 7 sort of leading mayoral candidates were asked to respond to questions. They did, and at the end, and there is a video out there somewhere in YouTube land if you want to look for it. I don't, but there's a video of these 7 candidates with their arms around each other singing Kumbaya. And that's when the paper said, we can't tell you apart. You're too much, the divisive campaigns, we're used to you attacking people. They would not attack at that point, because some of the early people who came out and attacked lost pretty big. And so campaigning went from attack ads, heavy media buys, to it became door-to-door, like community organizing. Door-to-door. How many hands can you shake? How many people have you touched? How have you talked? How have you asked for second and third choice votes if you can't get first choice votes? And the difficulty of how do you ask for a second choice vote if they've literally just said to your face, no, I'm not going to vote for you. well, would you vote for me second? And so there was, Fair Vote Minnesota held a debrief or lessons learned after that election, and they brought in some of the campaign managers, including from the woman who won the mayoral race that year, to say, what did you learn and how would you advise candidates in the future? And so that was an interesting perspective to see that the tone had changed. It stayed that way in 2017 too. There weren't negative campaigns. Where negativity started to bubble up, it was pretty quashed pretty quick by the community, who said, oh, well, then we don't want you first, second, or third. If you're going to bash that person, I don't care what you think about that person. I care about what you think. What's your policy? What's your position on this issue? So that has changed the rhetoric of campaigning. In terms of representation, the re-elect everyone election of 2009 was re-electing people who had been there from the previous term. They were mostly white. There were, I think, 2 people of color. Mostly middle-aged or older. Mostly, I think I'm correct here, all but one, property owners, which is a big thing for Minneapolis, where more than 50% of our population are renters. So you had this divide between people who owned property, who were white, who were older, who were middle class, and they were the elected officials. In 2013, we had only our second ever female mayor. We had our first Latina council member, our first East African council member, our first Southeast Asian council member, so Hmong, Somali, Latino. We had 2 Jewish members, a Muslim. I'm trying to think of some of the other diversity points that in my PowerPoint I spell these out. And then in the last election in 2017, we've increased that to include, now we have, I think we're the first, I know the paper said we were the first, but I don't know if this is true or not. The first 2 transgendered elected council members. We have the biggest diversity in age. So our youngest council member elected ever was 22. It's my boss. And then the oldest is 63. So that's quite an age range on the council, representing from the millennial to the baby boomer. The experiences that they brought to the table outside have diversified. So in the past, they typically represented the professions, right? Lawyers tend to dominate, people who have means or a higher economic status. Now we have an artist, we have a community organizer, we have someone who went to school to be a land use development planner, like a zoning person, which is hugely helpful on the city council, which does zoning and land use issues. They have some business people, IT, marketing, education, nonprofit. So their worldview perspectives outside of politics has diversified, their age range has diversified, their how they self-identify in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, those things have diversified. So do I say RCV accomplished that? No, I can't. I don't think there's a direct correlation. Do I think that RCV providing maximum access to the ballot, maximizing a person's choice in a race, and putting everybody on the general election, not winnowing it out, helped amplify that opportunity? Absolutely.
I'm going to have to just say that this is our last question.
Okay.
I was just curious about whether you talked about how the campaigns ran differently. Did you see any overt preferencing between candidates, where candidates would say to their supporters, vote me number 1, vote this person number 2? I mean, I'm from Australia, where we use preferential voting, and that's how people campaign. So they will actively trade off preferences to try to shape the legislative body to be most conducive to their particular candidate's goals.
We haven't seen that in our 3 elections yet. What's come closest for us in this last, of course, candidates are learning the system too, right? So their approach to campaigning has changed. In the last election in 2017, what was interesting as a sideline watcher, right? Somebody who's close to the politics but removed. We had a woman get reelected who was first elected in 2013. She was part of that major change that came in. She served 1 term, and she ran for re-election. She ran from a ward which has historically never re-elected a council member, never. This ward in Minneapolis is very unique. It's sort of the busiest and fastest growing business hub, especially restaurants, bars, places of entertainment, and older established neighbors, right? So every election term, it goes from an older person who's been in the neighborhood forever and lived there and owns property to a younger person who represents the college kids. The next year, it's over here. It has ping-ponged back and forth 50 years. She won re-election, and she won it hands down. Like, her nearest competition wasn't really competition. Because she had gained such popularity in her 4 years as a freshman council member, she actually took the time to go out and she got other people who thought like her, who shared her political philosophies, to run for office in other wards. She was shaping the council, and she shaped the campaign. She's now our council president. So she not only shaped her own re-election, she shaped the council that chose her to be its leader. That was interesting.
We did have that experience in North Carolina in the only RCV election we ran. And even though it was a judicial, nonpartisan contest, there's no such thing as a nonpartisan election, as far as I'm concerned. It was very interesting. The Democrats had a favorite. There were 13 candidates. The Democrats had a favorite, and they put all their eggs in that basket. That candidate won the most first choice votes in that election. The Republicans teamed up and supported each other. And the Republican who finished second in the first choice votes ended up winning the election as a result of getting more second and third choice votes from his other Republican candidates. So yes, they figured it out. The Democrats didn't, and that decided the election, quite frankly. So it makes a difference.
Well, it's my sad duty to bring an end to this conversation. It's been delightful. Thank you both, George Gilbert, Casey Carl, for coming so far, and looking forward to the afternoon's testimony.
Well, I'm not looking nearly as forward to that as I did to this. Sit there and do a PowerPoint presentation in 7 minutes and then answer 5 minutes of questions. That's no fun.
Well,
this has been fun.
Well, then here's an invitation to some more fun, because even though I officially, out of respect for everyone's time, need to say we're concluding, I welcome you to stay right here and continue the conversations as long as our guests are willing to do that. Thanks especially to the officials who made time to be here with us today. And I hope you will all feel free to step to the front of the line. Fair Vote Washington supporters, if you don't mind, make space for our special guests, to our elections officials who came today. Thank you very much for being here. And I will.
And thank you for being here. Okay. Good to see you again, Julie.